How hot is it going to get? And what does the government need to do to prepare? There's a new warning today, which we'll discuss on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. Today, the British government was warned that they need to do a lot more to get the country ready to deal with the effects of climate change. Now, this is separate from what they're already doing to cut our carbon emissions, which contribute to climate change. This is about the changes that will have to be made to infrastructure and buildings, you name it, to cope with the changes that are going to come. This has come in the form of a letter from the Climate Change Committee to ministers. They're the independent committee that monitors how the government is doing when it comes to managing the climate. And what's quite stark in their letter is the scenarios that the Climate Change Committee say we all have to prepare for. They say you have to be ready for global temperatures increasing by an average of 2 degrees by the end of the century, or maybe even 4 degrees by the end of the century. And that is quite a lot higher than the 1.5 degrees of warming, which is the most ambitious target in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which is kind of the foundation stone for how all the countries around the world fight climate change. So I've been hearing a lot more about what's going on here because there are a lot of climate change dots to be joined. And I've been speaking to Emma Pinchbeck, who is the CEO of the Climate Change Committee, who were the authors of that letter. Emma, hello.
Hello.
And welcome back to Newscast.
Thank you. Feel like long time no see.
We'll get into the substance of all of this in a second, but just the processology first. So why did your adaptation committee write this letter to the government in the first place? What was the backstory?
So Minister Hardy, who is the minister in government in charge of climate change adaptation in DEFRA, which is the Environment Department, wrote to us to ask us for what our best advice would be on both the timeline for adaptation and the temperature that they should be preparing to adapt to the UK for. And it's the first time they've done that. So this is us issuing that advice, but we've also set the scene for a wider framework for what the government should be doing to help us work out how to adapt the economy to the impacts of climate change.
And so Emma Hardy, the minister, what do you think she was doing by asking you to write this letter? What was she hoping to achieve?
I think they were using us in the way that the committee is meant to be used, which is to ask experts for the best scientific framing for something that the government is seeking to do. We've got a very good idea about how to mitigate, which is the technocratic way of saying, like, get rid of emissions in the UK economy and the carbon budgets and the Climate Change Act. But what we're trying to do to adapt the UK economy is much less clear, and the government hasn't had that same kind of framework. So we think this is the first step in them doing that. And you want experts and scientists to tell you what the temperature risk is and what our best view is of where the UK should be going. How the government then prepares is obviously for them, but I think it was a totally appropriate use of our expertise.
Interesting. We'll talk about the actual substance and the issues around adaptation in a second, but you mentioned the temperature scenarios there. And I think for me, that's the initially eye-catching thing about this letter because, let's discuss it. There's a few different scenarios here, isn't there? There's limiting the increase in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees, which is kind of like the most ambitious goal in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Then there's 2 degrees, which is the less ambitious. And then you also in this letter mentioned 4 degrees by the end of the century. So which one of those does the committee think we're on the current trajectory to hit?
So there's a few different things there, and you're right, we spent most of the day explaining this, and I would imagine we'll continue to explain it. But the work to remove emissions from the economy and the kind of aim for where we need to go in emissions reduction in order to do our fair share of reducing emissions to have a plausible chance of getting the world down to a long-term temperature goal of 1.5 degrees is still very much the thing that we are recommending that we do. But if you look at where the temperature is going, we're measuring, I think, a temperature of around 1.4 degrees globally now. And so the work of our other committee of experts is what should we do to manage the impacts of climate change as they materialize? And if you're doing risk management, anyone in a business would tell you if you're doing risk management, you plan for the worst. Given that we're 1.4, the Adaptation Committee has said it is sensible for the government to start on the assumption that we might hit 2 degrees globally and work all the way up to the worst case scenario, which we still can't rule out as 4 degrees. Now, we're not saying that will happen. We're just saying when you're doing risk planning, you think through worst possible outcome and you think of minimum possible worst case outcome. And to make that more concrete for people, if you think about something like flood defences or even the Thames Barrier in London, when we last built the Thames Barrier, we haven't built it sufficiently resilient enough for the climate impacts we're now experiencing now at 1.5. And we'll need to spend money on retrofitting existing defences. And so what you don't want to do is end up advising government to do a minimal thing, which then they turn out they have to do again.
Right.
So that's why there's a difference.
So this is less you and your colleagues taking a view on where we're headed based on the current climate pledges by countries around the world right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of that in that the reason the committee is saying it's sensible to start at 2 is that you can see that we are not on track for 1.5 degrees globally at the moment, and also that we're at 1.4 and experiencing significant impacts. And so it's kind of sensible risk management to say 2. But the committee were very, very careful to say the long-term temperature goal is still something we should be aiming for. And we said that both in this letter and in our advice when we advised on the carbon budgets.
Nuance. Although it is very alarming that we still have to think about a temperature increase of 4 degrees, like at all.
Yeah, although the scientists will, then a level down, you get into high or low likelihood, right? And we're not saying 4 degrees is inevitable. In fact, if you look at trends for things like clean electricity generation and batteries and electric vehicles and heat pumps, which I've come on and talked about lots of times before, it does look like the emissions curve is bending, and that there's a good sign now that we might be able to rule out some of those high temperature outcomes. That said, not robust enough that the scientists are willing to do it. And the other thing that's really important about risk is there's a tendency to think of it as linear, as in, well, it was just, you can calculate what half a degree extra will actually mean in terms of impact, and it'll be kind of a straight line. Actually, one of the reasons for the 1.5 degree target is beyond 1.5 degrees, stuff just gets a lot less predictable in terms of the impacts and the extremes. And so it's not out of the question that you start to trigger some of the things like tipping points where there's an accelerating effect, and then you get into things like 4, and the science and those things are less clear. So again, we're not going to rule out the top end because we can't yet. There are good signs because of the energy transition that it won't be that, but equally there are other things that we're still looking at in the science, like things like tipping points. And so the scientists on the committee have said 2 to 4. That's what we should be planning for.
And then it made me go back to the report the Climate Change Committee had done about adaptation that you published earlier this year. And I mean, it's quite... I don't know if it's just that when you read the things at the time and it's in the news cycle and you report on it and then you move on to the next thing. But I was actually quite shocked when I went back to it today. And I sort of don't remember being that shocked when I read it at the time when it came out a few months ago. And the first thing that's shocking is just the risks that we're talking about here. Things like in one scenario, half of the UK's top quality agricultural land being at risk of flooding.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. I think we are saying a quarter of all buildings, not including any new houses that are built, at risk of flooding by 2050. We're talking about children already missing school, 1.7 school days a year on average, and that will get worse. I think there's a report out about the NHS that says 90% of NHS buildings are at risk from extreme heat and haven't been adapted. You're talking about, we already know we lost 2,500 people in the heat wave in 2022. Waiting figures for this year's heat wave, but it will be similar because it's a vulnerable population, not least the elderly, for example, in care home settings. And we're talking about up to 10,000 people, excess deaths from heat dying by 2050. You're talking about a third of all rail and road kilometres being affected by extreme weather by 2050. These are considerable risks. And so that's part of the reason it's good that the government is starting to think about what the framework that they need to change. Because the other thing we said in that report is the risks are known, but we have said to government for multiple years, your adaptation program is not working. And we've had, I think we're coming up for the fourth national adaptation plan, and we haven't seen concrete outcomes in the economy to tackle any of these risks.
Yeah, I was going to say that was the second thing that shocked me about going back to your report, because you do one of those red, amber, green tables of monitoring the government's process, and there's a lot of red and a lot of amber and hardly any green. So the adaptation process in government is going very, very badly.
Yes.
Yeah,
agreed.
Really badly. But have we worked out why that is? Do you guys have it's this reason, and this reason, and it all adds up to a lot of red and amber and very little green?
Right. So if you think about what we do on emissions reduction, there's a clear plan. We all know what the target is and what date we're aiming for. So there's a kind of sense of what good looks like. And then underneath that, we do 5 yearly recommendations on the road to meeting that target. We offer advice, and the government sets out plans to deliver. And then we look at progress every year. And all the departments in government are signed up to that because it was a parliamentary objective, and they've got this neat structure. In the letter today, we say that's what's missing on the adaptation side. So we've got the national adaptation program, but we don't really have a sense of what outcome we're trying to achieve in any government department. There's not cross-government working on this. And this is the first step to the government deciding what they're aiming for. Is it to focus on the most vulnerable in a heat wave, for example, and good looks like critical services staying open and people in care homes and schools being protected? It's this kind of detail that's missing. And if we have that, we can then make sure that parliamentarians get the information they need to hold government to account, and they can get buy-in across Whitehall. And while that's missing, no one really knows what we're trying to deliver. So I know it's quite technical. I know it's about sort of government policy frameworks rather than the actual measures. But getting that right is the important first step. The other thing is we're doing a report called Well Adapted UK, which we'll be publishing in the spring. It's our 5 yearly really serious advice to government on what adaptation should look like. And for the first time, we're going to get into what good could look like in different areas of the economy, in food. You've mentioned farming, in healthcare, in education, right across the economy, and make proposals for the solutions to make it better.
And I mean, does the government have an explanation or a defense for why they've not done so well in all of this stuff? And is anything they say about that, is that believable?
They've responded to our advice previously, and what it turns into is the government committing to do things in the national adaptation programme. But I would guess that this lack of clarity about what they're trying to achieve, actual objectives from government given out to the departments, across departmental agreement of what they're all trying to do, money for the measures, and then kind of a delivery mechanism, a much better national adaptation program. It's this stuff that often gets the wheels turning in government, and that's been missing, unlike on the emissions reduction side.
I mean, Ed Miliband is always talking about the big government mission to take all the carbon dioxide out of the electricity generating sector in the UK. Do you ever hear him talking about adaptation?
I think the government's mission is very much about emissions reduction and
less about this.
And has been less about this, apart from the minister has written to the Climate Change Committee and said, look, we want to do this. This is the first step. Please give us your advice. So it's a new government. They've asked us for some advice. I really hope that this turns into something really thorough for what they're trying to do for the UK economy and for society as we start to experience more significant impacts of climate change.
I just keep thinking about what you said earlier on about the Thames flood barrier. And actually, that's quite a good example of all of this, because we all look at it and we sort of pat ourselves on the back that, it was a really clever bit of engineering. It was done at the right time. It actually even looks quite nice when you can go for a walk, and it looks quite good on TV. And yeah, we're sort of a bit complacent about it. But you're basically saying if the government doesn't get its act together and start thinking about how to upgrade that piece of infrastructure, then either it's going to get overwhelmed and there'll be a massive flood in London, which will come at a massive cost to everyone, whether you live in London or not, or we'll have to pay loads more to build a new one rather than investing in a better one now. That's what it comes down to, really. That's the whole thing in a nutshell, if you could put the Thames flood barrier in a nutshell.
But I think the one that I think about a lot at the moment is stuff like air conditioning in hospitals, because we've just had a heat wave, and or in care homes where we know that we're going to get more heat waves with more frequency even now. We know that the NHS estate, that our care home settings, that our schools are not prepared. And we know what the consequences of that are, both in terms of health and missed education. There should be a plan in government, arguably, to do something about that. And the fact that it's not being done would just mean you will have to do it at some point, and how those costs fall will likely be more expensive. So
No, but then
yes, on the big bits of infrastructure.
But that's a classic example of a trade-off, though, isn't it? Because Wes Streeting, the health secretary, will have to decide whether to spend £1 on, I don't know, rebuilding a crumbling hospital or fixing the roof of a hospital, or £1 on investing in air conditioning in a hospital. And actually, maybe the patients would prefer that it was just a bit less crumbly rather than a bit climate adapted.
Yeah, but I suppose if you've got good advice on what adaptation could look like, what you're essentially doing is making sure that patients in 10 years' time aren't annoyed that when you repaired the hospital, you didn't think about putting the cooling measures in at the same time, right? So there are some trade-offs. There are also ways of making sure you're not spending money twice because you build something to the wrong size, you build something in a floodplain, you don't have cooling put into your new buildings, whatever it is. You're not planting trees when you're putting up new estates. I think it's also about saving money in the long run. The Climate Change Committee's job is to try and give government a good advice about like what those trade-offs might look like, making decisions on them, obviously, for ministers. And we're doing all of that analysis in our Well-Adapted UK report, which is coming this spring.
And I look forward to reading it. Another thing I've put in my phone calendar on the basis of this conversation. Just lastly, and I know your job doesn't allow you to really get political, but I'll ask you the question anyway. How does it feel in the current kind of political conversation we're having, where you've got Kemi Badenoch saying a Conservative government would repeal the Climate Change Act and approach the whole net zero thing very differently? And then, I'm thinking about Zach Polanski, the Green leader, who was sat in the Newscast studio a few weeks ago talking about his party conference. And he said his priority wasn't necessarily like the environment and climate change. It was the cost of living and people's bills.
I'm hearing a lot at the moment from the opposition parties and from the government about energy bills, cost of living, economic growth. And I think what we said in the 7th carbon budget analysis is that when you look out to 2050, removing our dependency on fossil fuels saves money on the household bill. It saves money on driving costs. We think the cost to GDP is about 0.3% of GDP a year to rewire the entire economy. It makes us more secure from a future gas price spike. There are lots of economic reasons that you would do this anyway. If you're worried about things like industrial electricity prices, you want new industries and all of that stuff. I think getting that message across is really important. That's the first thing. And then I think thinking about today and adaptation, the Climate Change Act is also the legislation that enables the Climate Change Committee to give independent adaptation advice to government. It sets up the framework for adaptation in the UK, such as it is, and is the place to go for building it out. I haven't heard any political party say that climate change isn't happening and there won't be significant risks to the people of this country. And so I think, happily, thinking about how we plan for climate change impacts is something that there is still political consensus on. The last thing I'd say, though, is those impacts get worse if you don't meet 1.5 degrees. So we're twice as likely to have serious flooding events at 2 degrees than 1.5 degrees. We're much more likely to have extreme heat waves at 2 degrees than 1.5 degrees. So adaptation is important, but you still have to answer the question of how big do you want the impacts to be for the UK public if you don't intend to try and do our bit to reduce emissions globally.
Emma, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.